We are live. Welcome, everyone, to Nighttime Logic. It's January 16th, 2024. Here in New York, it's cold as hell, and it's January, it's 2024. It feels like the future to this person here. And we're going to be talking about the future of horror with our guest, Brian Evenson. Welcome, Brian. How are you?
Good, thank you. Glad to be here again.
So we'll give people a sec. Yeah, welcome back. It's great to have you on the show again. Thank you so much for coming. Tonight we're going to be talking about um, McSweeney's issue number 71. This is the unslipcased, not the prize inside here. I'll show the book while people are coming in. This is a really we're going to talk about judging a book by its cover before we talk about the excellent contents. But yeah, this is a really they did a really impressive job. Without even getting to the slipcase, I was a little bit intimidated. We're going to talk about breaking down boundaries and breaking down intimidations, but just when I saw this project, I'm like, oh no, it's hardcover. It's not single slipcase. It's not double slipcase. It's triple slipcase. I'm like, this is going to be a bitch and a half to just physically read. But this is a really readable book, despite its Bible leather bound thing. It's really, it's just for those of you who are concerned about that, it's just really accessible. I read it on vacation, and it's just a physical. It was just a physical pleasure, and it made me realize, just how important that is, and the thought that really went into the design of this is really thoughtful. So towards that,
the design is great, and I love the slipcases, but it's definitely like the first time you take it out, you're like, it's very hard not to be nervous about it.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, is this? Am I going to be concerned about reading it or breaking it, or is it going to be uncomfortable? But you're like, oh, this is it's so just physically comfortable to read, which is something to think about it. So yeah, let's talk about. We can't not just talk about the slipcase. Here's the outer slipcase, and then you get. I think this is number 2.
That's number 2.
That's number 2, and then oh yeah, this is number 3. When I took a photo of this for the image,
right?
And yeah, it's just there's something. Like Nighttime Logic, which I should talk about in a second, there's just something about the slipcases. There's something about the attention to it that it's just thematic. It doesn't quite line up, but there's something about the care. There's something about the way this book is made that just lines up with the intent of the book, your editorial intent, and the forward-facing intent of all these stories. So just judging it on that way, it's a really great project, and really happy to be talking about it tonight. Before we jump into the stories and introduce Brian properly, this is Nighttime Logic. This series is named after the term Nighttime Logic, which I vastly paraphrase as being the part of a story that is felt or not consciously processed. I posted a couple of links in the Facebook page where Kelly Link and other authors talk about it a bit. But we have to mention that I believe the term was coined by author Howard Waldrop, who, rest in peace, he just passed away very recently this week, and he's a fine author, very great author. And I believe he coined that term. Here's just one of his books from the great Small Beer Press of short stories. I know you liked his work too, Brian.
Yeah, I'm a fan of his work. I think he's a really interesting writer. Also very eccentric as a writer, which is one of the appeals of his work. So
I had a chance to hear him read briefly at one of the World Fantasies, and he signed this book, and I just looked at it when I came in there, and it was just like, what did he write? He was just like, there's good stuff in here, Howard Waldrop. So just a word to him being he coined the term that that term is a very important term to me. I named the series after it, and so
yeah, no, it's a shame. It's a shame he's gone. I was on the World Fantasy Committee that gave him the Lifetime Achievement Award a few years ago, and he was. I mean, I think that you can see kind of distinct lines within fantasy and science fiction, and he was kind of always more colloquial. He was kind of in his own space, but also made space for, writers like Andy Duncan and other people to kind of come after and and respond in some ways to what he did, but also do their own amazing thing.
Yeah. Sorry to hear of his passing. Howard Waldrop, for those looking to dig in. There's so much. My reading list is vast. I just can't keep up. Let's say hello to Lisanne and Rebecca, Obadiah, Jack, Morgan. Some people are here that we know. Hi, everyone. Let's introduce Brian before we start to talk about the stories. Brian Evenson is the author of 12 books of fiction. Most recently, the story collection "None of You Shall Be Spared," which came out last year from Weird House, which came out last year, and the Weird West micro collection "Black Bark," which came out last year as well from Black Shuck Books over in the UK. His collection "Song for the Unraveling of the World," which was out in 2019, won the Shirley Jackson Award and the World Fantasy Award, and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Ray Bradbury Prize. Previous books have won the American Library Association's RUSA Prize and the International Horror Guild Award, and have been finalists for the Edgar Award. He is the recipient of 3 O. Henry Prizes, an NEA Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Award. His work has been translated into more than 12 languages. He lives in Los Angeles and teaches at Cal Arts. A new collection, Good Night, Sleep Tight, is coming out this fall in 2024. Everyone, welcome again, Brian Evenson. Great to have you back, Brian.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So yeah, we're going to talk about McSweeney's issue 71, which I guess it is subtitled "The Monstrous and the Terrible." So in the introduction, you wrote a really informative introduction that your intention and McSweeney's intention in asking you to helm this project is for you to open up ways of new ways of for readers to look at contemporary horror. So maybe just tell people who may not have yet read an issue of McSweeney's what it is and why they asked you to helm this project.
Okay. McSweeney's is a literary magazine that was started by Dave Eggers, and it was originally started as a magazine that was publishing people who weren't being published in other magazines. And then I think over time it changed to be something else. It's always been a magazine that's very, very well designed. They do extravagant things and really beautiful things. And I've been in a couple of issues in the past, which is why I think that Dave and others there thought of me as a possibility to do this issue. So I kind of understood the aesthetic of McSweeney's. I also have a kind of foot in the horror world, and so I think the challenge was they wrote to me when I was actually on sabbatical, and they're like, "Would you like to do this?" And it was too fun to resist. So
how can you resist?
No, absolutely. And then so the question became, how. So that it was kind of a dual challenge in that McSweeney's isn't a magazine that's really known as a horror magazine or genre magazine, even though they published, Kelly Link, they've published Carmen Maria Machado, several other people that kind of at least have a foot in the world that we think of as horror. And so the challenge was figuring out how do you put together an issue of horror that also is a McSweeney's issue that's going to work for their readership and teach them something about horror, but also not disappoint the people who know the genre pretty well. So when I was doing that, it was just I was trying to figure out a range of horror, some that was that was kind of leaning more literary, some that was kind of more helping people to understand what horror was if they weren't familiar with the genre, and then some that was a little more sophisticated and hopefully would be satisfying for people who know the genre pretty well.
Yeah, it's a great project. It's an enjoyable project, and yeah, it's an important project for all those reasons that you mentioned. Let's take one bit of that. So, let's talk about some of the in the introduction you talk about breaking down some of those walls or barriers. What do you think some of those preconceptions or pre-contexts or walls or barriers can be from either side? Like I'm experiencing them as a genre writer, and my context from that came as, I was a genre writer. I wasn't sure really where I fit. I was on the outside of it. Very early on in my writing journey, I came across the story, or I came to McSweeney's to have a look at Private Grave 9 by Karen Joy Fowler, which really helped open up my mind to, wow, what a horror story could be, or what a literary story could be, or this borderland, or this perhaps these distinctions, or perhaps these meaningless distinctions. What do you think some of those walls or barriers are that you were looking to chip away at with your story choices? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that from the literary side of things, I think that there can be a tendency that I see with my students, or that I've seen kind of with people in the university world, to think that you know what horror is in advance. And usually it's that kind of notion of like, oh, I know what horror is really based on a particular kind of horror that came out of the 70s and 80s, and nothing at all against that kind of horror. It's something that's been formative for a lot of people. But
it might just be that default position, like The Exorcist, or
exactly,
or the knife is coming at the screen or something.
Right. So slasher movies, The Exorcist, Stephen King as well, but a particular kind of range of Stephen King's work. And usually it's like what they've heard about Stephen King rather than having actually read Stephen King. So that was I think the thing that I was trying to fight against, just the idea of like, horror is this, horror does this particular thing, and I have a box for it already. And really what's happened, I think, in the last 10 or 20 years even, is that horror's just kind of exploded and gone in all sorts of different directions. So that there's a lot more variety in terms of what it's doing. There is stuff that is called horror now that you can find, for instance, in Ellen Datlow's terrific kind of end of the year anthologies that maybe doesn't fit the mold in the same way exactly. And so really what I set out to do when I was working on this anthology was to try to put together just as much of a range of horror and what was going on as I could, so that I could kind of start to break up those misconceptions or preconceived notions of what horror was. And then, I mean, I think the other thing is that, on the other side, I feel like it's easy for someone who kind of knows the genre to start reading in certain paths as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's like there's certain kinds of horror I really like. There's other kind of subgenres that I'm not as crazy about. So it was also like I was kind of aware of that and trying to break that up a little bit for myself as well, just to try to expand the range.
I feel like that's the one for me where I'm like, I know what I like, I'm sticking to it. And whenever I go out of that comfort zone, and over the years, all the people who are smarter than me and all my mentors or teachers have always the one bit of advice that's crossed the years or crossed the teachers is to push their students out of the comfort zone, and this book definitely did it for me. You started out perhaps on the literary side, or more on the literary side. You mentioned one of your early collections or books was I believe it's called The Wavering Knife, a story collection, and that got nominated and I think it even won an International Horror Guild Award. Did you write that as a horror collection, or what were you thinking when you wrote that? Sorry about the question, but right, like I know you talk about being perhaps surprised or becoming this is the point where you were aware of these preconceptions, and it was sort of a path into talk about that a little bit.
I mean, you know, I always thought of myself as just a literary writer who was writing really weird stuff. And you know, and it was weird. People didn't always know what to make of me. But that was just kind of what I did. There was a kind of gothic edge to it, and a kind of you know, playing around with notions of cruelty and things like that. But I really saw it as like innovative literary fiction. And then
you weren't thinking horror, or were your preconceptions in place? Like, I mean, before I knew what horror was, I had these preconceptions of like, I don't write horror.
Right.
Until I was published in horror, then I'm like, I write horror. Okay.
Yeah.
horror is not this. Horror is this.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's I think exactly what happened is I had this notion of what horror was. It was not a very sophisticated notion. I was kind of dismissive of it. And then I had this thing happen where The Wavering Knife, that book of stories, which was published like by Fiction Collective too, so like an innovative small press that sees themselves as doing literary fiction. It's published there, and it was nominated for this International Horror Guild Award, and I was like, that's weird. There's been, you know, I couldn't figure it out exactly, and then it won. And that was even weirder to me. And I was like, oh, well, what's going on? And so I started reading the other collections that have been up for the prize and realized very quickly that what I thought of horror was just not the case, that the genre was not what my preconceived notions had it as being. And that kind of led me to reading other people. And suddenly I realized that, you know, maybe I was writing horror after all. And it wasn't that my writing really changed or didn't change dramatically. It was just that
the boxes or the ways of talking about it. That's an amazingly powerful thing. So, more powerful than perhaps we give credit for.
Yeah.
I mean, just look at Jeff, the great Jeff Vandermeer. I mean, I just recall him, you know, being at KGB bar reading his fungus-laced, mushroom-filled stories and just being like, he's the weirdest guy in town, and then just sort of a change, like nothing. I don't think anything's changed about Jeff's writing over the years, except for just maybe marketing, like lenticular, like someone just said, don't look at it this way, look at it this way, and sell 1 million copies. And and that's
it's so interesting. Yeah, the way in which just the way in which you come to something really has such a huge effect on how you see it and what you see there. And you know, and I honestly, I see this too with my own fiction in terms of I have an audience that I have some stories that have been published first in a literary magazine and then have been like in a best of horror end of the year thing, or vice versa. And the responses from like the literary readers and the horror readers are just often, it's not that they're totally unrelated, but they're different. They notice different things about the work. And you know, I've been lucky enough for them to both make sense of it. But yeah. So, but it is almost like they're reading two different stories, even though it's the same story. And it's just how they come to it.
It's made me a lot more forgiving. In fact, pretty lenient about things I might be disdainful of, by saying like, oh, this is a great thing for someone. This is an introduction to someone. I think just American horror stories just coming to mind, like something. Whereas if like maybe you're more experienced in horror, you just might see all the influences on the sleeve and it's not doing anything to you. But then like you might take someone who has never read or watched horror and they're like, oh wow, this is a particular joy.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just I don't know what, there's something significant about it. I don't know what it is, but it's certainly a thing. And and it's a thing that you're doing in McSweeney's 71. So you mentioned when you won that award, you began looking at other authors. I think one of those authors that was around the time, and if one of those authors, if I'm not mistaken, was Peter Straub, that you came to Peter Straub around that time?
I did, pretty close to that time, I think. And Peter, I mean, Peter was such an interesting writer because he was someone who grew up reading a lot of kind of innovative poetry. Something he kind of continued to do. So was very aware of kind of these trends in literary kind of poetry like language poetry and other things.
Yeah.
And so he had that on the one hand. On the other hand, he just read really widely, was really interested in horror, but just wrote it with just such an elegant style. And so when I came to Peter and his work, I just realized again, it was one of those moments where I was like, oh, it's the literary and genre don't have to be all that far away from one another. And you can kind of lean over the fence one way or the other, depending on what you're doing.
Yeah, I think you put it really elegantly in your introduction. I think you said you were thinking about the distinctions, and when you read Straub, you realized that, as interesting as they are, those distinctions were meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
Peter Straub edited something really similar to this project a solid 20 plus years ago. This is a copy of Conjunctions, number 39, The New Wave Fabulous. Peter was really generous of his time. I had a chance to talk to Peter on this series about some of the work that he edited, including this. How you mentioned that this book and others, particularly this and the work of Peter Straub, was an influence on what you wanted to do in McSweeney's 71. How did that influence your choices?
Well, so that issue, the New Wave Fabulist issue that Peter Straub and Bradford Morrow put together, it's really interesting because what they did is they took a kind of high art literary magazine and they opened its doors and brought in writers who were known as genre writers. So there's like a Gene Wolfe story in there. There's a John Crowley story in there. There's a bunch of people.
Kelly Link's
in there. Yeah. And what I think happened that was so interesting is that, if again, it's all about context. It's like you find what you're looking for in some ways. So if you had just seen these in a genre magazine and had not been all that interested in genre, you wouldn't necessarily, have noticed the work in the same way. But having it in a literary magazine, I think you really start to notice the care with which all those writers are, working and operating. And so the thing that I really felt like I learned reading that issue was that what was going on in genre fiction, the best of it was as good as what was going on in the best of literary fiction. And that for me was the interesting thing, the really good genre fiction, the really good literary fiction, what those things had in common and how they could kind of exchange things. So when I was putting together this issue for McSweeney's, I wanted to kind of put together an issue that both had pieces that if you know horror, that you would recognize some of the names. So Stephen Graham Jones is in there, a few other people, depending on how well you know the genre. But I also wanted to include people that people from the horror world wouldn't necessarily know, but people from the literary world might. And so it was.
That stuff is definitely, as we're going to talk about, it's still really horrific.
Yes.
And we're talking a lot about changing things, and you might get the sense like I don't know, but this stuff is just as brutal, if not more brutal and upsetting and disturbing as anything you're going to call horror, and which is why this really is forward facing. I guess I'm showing my level of sophistication, or at least the level of sophistication when I started out by saying, so when I was a kid, or until my teen years, my local libraries, I think they had this really high-tech system of like on the spine of the books, there was a rocket ship or a dragon, or I forgot what, maybe horror was a skull, or maybe there wasn't even that. So it was just sort of like fiction and nonfiction, and then maybe in fiction there was like rocket ship, dragon, skull. So when so it's been amazing. Like, yeah, it goes back to the context. It never ceases to be amazing and interesting to me, the process of subdividing into categories, which is still infinitely interesting, and then getting back to what you said in your introduction, as deep as we want to delve about how these and talk about these distinctions, which you're great at. You have a great way of talking about these elucidating these contexts, and then of just going back to how those distinctions are meaningless. One of those authors that I pulled off the shelf, not knowing anything about genre or anything, was Lucius Shepard. I think you mentioned that he was one of the people that you had looked at around that time of the Horror Guild Award. So yeah, I'm like playing. I think this is the end of my show and tell right now. I have a copy of Lucius Shepard's Viator, which I know is one that you're fond of. I'll never hesitate to mention Lucius Shepard because he was just someone who's very influential to me, someone that I love, and just someone in need of wider recognition. Let's just talk about Lucius Shepard. We'll just give him a little airtime before we jump into the stories in 71.
No, I think Lucius is was a terrific writer. I mean, passed away. And something like Viator, the thing I love about a book like that is it's kind of a haunted house story, but the setting's really weird. The details are really weird. It just feels like the kind of story that only he could have written. And then he has these pieces that are either war or war adjacent that are just very, very haunting and very, very strange. That I really love. But yeah, very, very interesting writer for sure.
And just in showing, I didn't even think about what Lucius Shepard was. I mean, when I pulled it off, I pulled up the Jaguar Hunters and I was just like, cool cover. And then when I read the Jaguar Hunters, just insert the sound of my 14-year-old mind being blown. I didn't know what it was. I didn't care what it was, but that was why I wanted to read. I wanted to feel like, I mean, Lucius Shepard really took you to places and trains of thought. I'm just really fortunate too. I guess I've read him at that early age.
That's amazing. You read him that young. And for me at that age, it was Gene Wolfe, who I found the same way in the library, going through the science fiction section. I hadn't read anything in the W's, just pulled a book off by random, like the cover. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing and very different than I thought it would be. And those kind of weird decisions just make have a huge impact on you, I think, as a writer.
Viator is a ghost story of sorts. You mentioned that you hope we're going to get to the first one in 71 here. You mentioned that you hope that you could pick a group of stories that had that satisfaction that comes from horror and ghost stories. What are some of those satisfactions that, going on the genre side now, that horror stories, ghost stories, or and what might those differences be?
Well, I feel like, for me, horror is so bound up in mood, kind of creating a particular mood, unsettling you, making you feel like the world is kind of slipping out from under your feet. I mean, those are all things I try to do in my work. And for me, it's like it's such a different genre in that way. If you think of other genres, it's like literary fiction. We think of some, usually in terms of style, we think of science fiction as something that's very, it's about the future. And horror is about, it's about being scared, or it's about, this kind of feeling of kind of a creepy feeling. So that's one thing that I just think is very specific to horror and kind of goes across a lot of different genres. Some horror is more kind of direct about that than others. So just there's a huge range. The ghost story for me, I did a PhD in 18th century literature and read a lot of Gothic stuff. That was one of my major fields, was Gothic literature. And it was so interesting to go back and just see how that genre starts to develop, and then how it's changed since then. And once you get to the 20th century, there's just such amazing stuff that
it really starts to change. It
really starts to change, and James and others are doing great things. Onions, the Beckoning Fair one, which is probably my favorite ghost story of all time.
And you've been a guest at the New York Ghost Story Festival. You've talked about some of these changes or these points of change are definitely of interest to us, for sure.
Yeah. And it is a question. I mean, I think when you get to contemporary ghost story, I think the thing you have to ask is, what is it doing that can be, that's different than what's been done before, or what is it about it that's contemporary. So I think sometimes people do kind of pastiche of an older style of ghost story for a contemporary story, and those stories can work as well. But I think one of the interesting things is the ghost story is bringing something new. So we've talked, I think, in the past about smoke ghost.
Oh, I was just thinking the smoke ghost is a real pivot.
Yeah.
There's a real pivot point where I mean, that one, you know, I come back to that story more and more. I just recently was revisiting that one, and that one really, it's like even just more meta. Like, you know, even in the text of the story, you have someone in a very male-centric voice. He's talking to his secretary, like just. It doesn't feel verisimilitude at all, because he's just like talking to himself. What do you think a modern ghost would be, Miss? You know, he's just the things he's talking about are absolutely fascinating and pivotal to the genre. The dialogue itself is not the strongest, but it's a fantastic story.
Yeah, the imagery in that story is just really great, and there is some,
and the themes
the ambiguity of it. You and I have talked before about ambiguity, the way in which. For me, that's the other thing, that there's a lot of good horror puts you in a space where you don't necessarily know the exact details of what's happening, and that puts you in kind of the same perspective as the protagonist, but you know that it's bad.
and it allows for the night story, the night part of the story, as Waldrop said, and nighttime logic, as Kelly Link popularized too. So now these stories are operating differently. They're interacting with us. We talked about, well, why are these stories different to other to very rational, reasonable people? Context is one thing for sure, but then when these intentional ambiguities are in play, they're allowing the stories to operate differently, where it's not about catch the ghost, slay the ghost, overcome the ghost. You have these very humanistic stories, just as and you opened with this in your story selection. The Refrigerator Cemetery by let's say, is it Mariana Enriquez?
That's right.
And translated by Megan McDowell. And I was thrilled at this choice as a first story in the book. I highly recommend this project. And if you can just read one, or do you read at the end, do you read at the beginning, I highly recommend this book, and start at the beginning. It sets the stage in there. Why did what do you think about the Refrigerator Cemetery? I feel like it illuminates all the things you're saying in your introduction, what you're saying right now. Why did you choose it, or what did you think when you read it coming through your inbox? If that's
I'm a huge fan of Enriquez's work. I really like her short story collections, and then our Share of Night, or novel that came out last year, is one of the scariest books I've read in recent memory. And so I was really pleased when we reached out to her translator, and she reached out to Mariana, and there was, it looked like it was possible to get a story, and then it looked like it might not happen. Then everything kind of aligned, and so we got it.
Oh.
And then I think with a story like this, it's just it works so well as a literary story. It works so well as a horror story, and so it felt to me like a great story to start with, because it's like, you can kind of take two separate but kind of adjoined paths through the story, and so it kind of is both kind of bringing you into the book in terms of the mood of horror, but also there's a lot going on in terms of thinking about what it means to be human and suffer guilt and make choices, and all those sorts of things are there. And there's also a high level of ambiguity, especially when you get to the end of the story.
Yeah. So this story hit all the right notes for me. It starts off in the 1970s, where I have this, I don't know if it's a false or real nostalgia for that. I believe it is set in Argentina. It's not set in America, but it plays upon fears that of. Perhaps in our generation, I'm of the generation where they started taking doors off refrigerators, or when you see them at the curb, their doors would be off. And this is like a time like before that happened, and it's like there's such tension just in the introduction of the story of just like, we were kids and we were playing this game where it's like how long could we go without suffocating inside one of these things? You're just like, oh man, like
Yeah.
here's this. You're just like, oh, just the setup of it is
Yeah.
and bad stuff happens right from the get-go, and it's just not even that's not even the thrust of the story. Of course someone dies in this game, and that's just the inciting incident. That's just the push-off part for perhaps what you were calling the other thread of the story, right? So like there's very horrible things happening, but then there's and is it cliche or is it a trope of just I guess I want to call it the human is worse, perhaps like then the things that like the things that the decisions that the depending on, I guess, where your moral compass lies or where your sympathies lies, like at best there are some really bad decisions going on. Was that what you meant by the second
Well,
half
I think
of the story?
partly, yeah. I mean, I think that Eugene Thacker talks about that. He talks about kind of two ways of thinking about the monster, thinking about what's horrible. And on the one hand, it's something that comes from outside, very much kind of the Lovecraftian thing, where it's foreign and strange and separate. And then the other is that like the monster is the thing inside that's somehow even worse. And so the idea that the main character in that story who's telling the story has both been kind of damaged by what's happened, but also has it's hard to totally sympathize with her in some ways. So she's very complicated and morally somewhat complicated. And so I think that that's part of the engagement of that other path.
Did you say Thacker was the name that
Eugene Thacker. He has a book which is called Tentacles Longer Than Night.
Okay.
Which talks about horror. It's one of 3 volumes that does, but he talks a little bit about is it kind of from serial killer? It's like the kind of horror from inside human, and then you have the kind of Lovecraftian thing as the horror outside, and then there's things that somehow are both at the same time.
This story just goes back and forth across that line so skillfully. Maybe I'll just cut it on that story there, just so people can have that joy. Let's just say that there's controlled ambiguity in there where I'm always looking. Could this be a strange tale? Is this a strange tale? And this is so much more than a strange tale, but it definitely at least meets that limited criteria that I have about this is a story that is working with intentional ambiguities that is affecting the main character and thus is affecting us, or at least presenting us with a lot of with something off the page. Strong choice for an opening story.
And I mean, she's interesting because she's someone who both is admired by the horror community and the literary community, and so I felt like that was also a good way to start. Just someone who seems to have figured out a way to communicate to both sides of that line.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad that there is that overlap, or someone, or someone who can act as a bridge that way. I was surprised, pleasantly surprised. As I'm flipping through the book, a name that I really liked, I didn't associate with horror. So, but an author who I'm really fond of, M.T. Anderson. Anderson had a story in there, and M.T. Anderson, I know him most prominently from a novel that I think is one of our finest. Feed. Feed is just, if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. How it's just it's so effortless, it's so lucid, it's so visionary. But if you think about it, like in the context of science fiction or YA or these other genres, horror, just at what happens in some of the choices, I think there's an argument to be made that you can look at least horror as a modality, or as a mode in Feed. But
it's really dystopic, that Feed is, and also feels all too plausible as well in terms of a plausible future that we might have to face.
And just to just to say a word about feed, yeah, it's just a story of where implants in humans are commonplace, maybe even mandated, and that's not even science fiction anymore. And but what I think Anderson's genius in that novel was just finding just this like little spot where it's the story of a young girl who, through no choice of hers, her father just decided that he didn't want to follow the rules and didn't want to give the girl this implant. So she's just like a disabled person, disabled. She just doesn't. She's not part of society, and she's just desperately wants to be a child. And there's something really horrific about that. So I was you picked the story. Do you speak French?
I do. Yeah.
Can you
Sure.
what's the name of that? I do. Yes.
Yeah.
Is there a doctor on board?
But Berceuse is the name of the story. Yeah.
Tell us about that story and how that fits into what you're doing with the book.
Yeah, I mean, I like Tobin's work. I've read most of his work, M.T. Anderson's work, but I wasn't really thinking of him in relation to this issue. But he ended up submitting something, and it was it was just so so great and so amazing. It's a very, very weird piece about a babysitter, and I like the tone of the piece. I like the way it's told. I like that there's a kind of escalating weirdness in it. It just gets weirder and weirder as it goes along. There's clues kind of early on where the parents don't seem to be completely sure what their baby's name is.
Right from the start, you're like, this is off. It simultaneously is like, oh, you can be like, oh, it's a story about a baby. How many, even the ones we like, Rosemary's Baby or all these, many of those have we seen? But like, even from the first line, like he's very just playing like with semantics and just like, you're like, oh, you're off balance. Cause like, it's smooth, but intentionally off. All the like little things there. And you're immediately put at a sense of unease.
Yeah. And I think you can kind of feel that you're going somewhere weird, but you don't know exactly where. And I think that's one of the great things about that story too, just that there are things he does there that are very hard to anticipate. And so yeah, I mean, it's really kind of in that weird horror space. I feel like it's like absurd in a lot of ways, but also genuinely unsettling, I hope.
So you talked about part of that unsettling is it's hard to anticipate. Which makes me think about tropes, right? So like tropes are good in like, we like, they're good when they deliver why we came to think. Yeah, I want a scary Halloween story. I want a scary story about a baby. Yet, and some people, right, and maybe to a matter of degree, pushes you out. You're like, oh, that was great until, most of the time that until is like, oh, that was where it got great.
Right.
But let's talk about the what is the importance of trope just to horror or to literature, and then we could talk about how some of these stories knock it down a bit.
Well, I mean, I feel like anytime you have a genre, you have expectations that go along with that genre, and those are things that kind of have built up over time. And they can be a good thing, but I think what happens is if a genre starts or a story starts fulfilling too closely our expectations for it, then it's not necessarily satisfying. So we like this combination of kind of repetition and surprise. And so having something that feels familiar and not familiar at the same time is kind of the thing that can really work, I think, with a story within a genre. So anytime, if you see an issue of a magazine and it calls itself The Monstrous and the Terrible, and you're going to have expectations that go with that associated with horror. And then the question becomes, how do you both fulfill those expectations and also keep on kind of moving things or shifting things so that people don't start feeling, oh, another horror story in this mode. Oh, another one. So yeah, it's a question of both kind of surprising the reader, but in a way that feels satisfying. And then also giving enough of the genre to feel like you're still connected to it.
I like that. It's just elegant and simplicity, like repetition and surprise. And going back to context and how we come to it, I'm thinking of the marketing for the movie The Witch. I think they were marketing that as the scariest movie you'll ever see. And right, so like in both ways, like they both fulfilled that expectation and turned off a lot of people. Like so some people expecting what they thought was going to be scariest, they were just like, oh my god, how this still flat. And then to others were just like the scare came in a, or the thrust came somewhere differently. So
right, exactly.
Yeah, it's just about what you're bringing to it. So two of the more different different stories or different kinds of stories that were added. I'll mention them both. One was Heartwood by Christine Muslim, and by The City That You Visit in Dreams Sometimes. How did those? What was surprising?
By Nick Mamadas.
By Nick Mamadas, yeah. Let's take Heartwood first. So that was a story that might. I guess I called it an idea story because maybe a trope that maybe it's not the zeitgeist at the moment, but yesterday's zeitgeist was, I don't know, fungus horror or plants by The Last of Us became a huge like water cooler hit.
Yeah.
So at first I'm like, oh, is this right? Like I had like similar reactions, like, oh, I trusted you and trusted the reader to be like, oh, this isn't jumping on that bandwagon. But how does Heartwood play with trope? Or does
I think Heartwood ends up being a story about environmental collapse and people who we don't know how many people are kind of unaffected at this point. So it could be some of the last people there.
I mean, that's kind of literary of you. It's about environmental collapse. The trees are trying to kill the last people.
There is that. Yeah,
this is like The Walking Dead. This is an episode of The Walking Dead, but instead of zombies, it's like the trees are spraying killer pollen on us.
Right. So there is that. I mean, and
it's environmental kind of collapse.
Weird kind of symbiosis that's occurring between the trees and humans, and and it seems very hard to stop as well. And you can see kind of gestures towards the Day of the Triffids, if you know that John Wyndham book. And then even that there's that M. Night Shyamalan.
Yeah. Was that called The Trees? What was that one called?
I can't remember what that's called. I never can remember, which is why I shouldn't have raised it. But
yeah. But Heartwood, whether right, like some of those are good, some of those are bad to us. But what I liked about Heartwood in this context, and I was looking at each story as the context of what is horrible? Like what were you, the editors, trying to tell us when you said breaking it down and saying what is horrible? So at first I was initially like, oh no, I've seen this before, but it also played on. There's a scene in The Matrix. It's just one little scene that is very haunting to me. I forget the name of the character. His name might be Cypher. It's when the character he says where he turns coat on the humans and he's just like, I don't care. I will turn traitor on humans, plug me back in as long as I get a steak. Just as long as I get that. And maybe it's not lining up exactly, but there's a character in here where they're talking about giving up because it is very hopeless. It is very desperate. Yeah. And the horrible idea of like, that's not even going to do it because there's the horror of that's going to invade your body where it's like you will become, you don't even get the benefit of being the Borg from Star Trek. You don't even get the peace. Like you will be invaded, but you'll still be you. And there's something incredibly a lack of agency. It was surprising that this was a story that raised at least the idea of, maybe one of the real horrors is lack of physical or mental agency.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's part of what that story is doing. And there's this sense of, the character, the narrator just keeps on going, even though they feel more and more like it's inescapable. I think the last line of the story is something like, last few words are the sense of inevitability was everywhere. And so it is this kind of weird slice of a moment. Whereas in something like The Last of Us, you kind of have more of an arc where you see people fight through something and get somewhere and maybe get at least some temporary equilibrium. Here, it's like we see a moment on the journey of someone who kind of knows they're not going to make it, but kind of keeps on going. And then, of course, there's the horror of potentially, giving in and then being dead but not at the same time. You're still alive. Who knows exactly? It's like there's the danger of being kind of locked in or being, that for me is just terrifying.
Yeah.
The idea of just not being able to control your body, not being able to kind of do anything. But yeah.
And yeah, it's just awful. And just raising another in the happening litany of horrors that you will have in this book here. What are some of the, let's take in this middle point of the show. When we come back from the middle point, I want to mention some things and some of our colleagues that are on my radar. But let's talk about are some of these things in the book on your mind and what you're writing, or tell us about what some of the things you're writing now. And I think you're going to read a little bit of something too.
I can, sure. I can definitely do that.
Are any of these topics fun that we're into? Before we came on, you mentioned I guess I was teasing Brian. I was calling him like the literary shark. Like I'm like, how do you read so much? And he's like, as long as I just read a lot, it's not good. And I was like, you're a shark, man. You're not human.
I like to read. I mean, it's my main hobby. It seems like.
Did this stuff influence you, or just influence you in inspiring you to follow your own paths?
Well, I mean, I feel like I'm. It can be a little bit of both. I mean, I definitely feel like I'm in a kind of strange story space and interested in the weird version of horror as well. So there's that. But yeah, I mean, the stories that I chose for this are stories that are all doing something that is interesting to me. I don't know if you'll see direct influences in terms of what I end up doing, but still, I mean, I feel like they're doing something. So like something like the Nick Mamata story that you raised, it has this kind of weird abstraction to it where it's not telling you a lot, but it still uses that to kind of build a sense of dread as you kind of read along with it, but you're not totally sure what's going on. And that's something that's really just intriguing to me, and to see that done and done well.
Yeah, I think you wrote the story that it just when you mentioned that your Labyrinth story from the anthology that came out just a few months ago. You wrote a story about a girl on a college campus and she's entering a labyrinth. And in Mamatas's story, we're talking about a stress dream of a city. And it just struck me that there's at least those uncertainties of interior world and place are striking me as a similarity. What are you going to read for us? Introduce it, and I'll put you on solo layout.
Sure. I can do that. I'm going to read, this is from None of You Shall Be Spared, the collection that Weird House published. The paperback of that is out. The hardbacks are kind of in the process of coming out, but you can get the paperback if you want. And I just thought I'd give you kind of a sample of from that book. So I'm just going to read
Take it away.
a teeny bit. Yeah. I'm going to read a piece called, part of a piece called The Teeth. Sorry. The first time he had gone over to Brother Monson's, Jens had known something was wrong with the man. His teeth were not right. What do you mean, not right? Asked his friend David later. Like they weren't really teeth, said Jens, or more like they were the ghosts of teeth. How can teeth have ghosts? Asked David, confused. Jens, puzzled, just shook his head. It wasn't something he could explain well, but he was sure he was right. He had gone there with his father, who had been sent over by their church to check on Brother Monson to make sure he was more or less okay. They had knocked on the door and had stood there for what seemed to Jens a very long time. If it had been just him, he would have left, but his dad just continued to wait, unperturbed, as if this were normal. I don't think he's there, said Jens. Where else would he be? Asked Jens's dad, and ruffled Jens's hair. And indeed, a moment later, the door opened. Ja, said Brother Monson, who there? He wore an olive work shirt with a button pocket over each breast. The shirt still showed creases from where it had been folded. He stood uncomfortably straight, as if he had no ability to bend or otherwise shift the vertebrae in his back. He wore thick glasses that were smeary with fingerprints, and his mouth hung partway open. Jens could see right inside of it. Brother Monson's teeth were ground down. They looked hollow inside, like empty casings. They didn't strike him as functional teeth at all. It's me, Brother Monson, said Jens's father, just checking to make sure all is well for you. All well, said Brother Monson, though he made the W sound like a V. And then stiffly he waved one hand at them and closed the door. Jens' father turned to him, face still creased with concern, and then slowly he shrugged. There's only so much you can do, he claimed, and then they both left. He had not said to his father, something is very wrong with Brother Monson's teeth. He wasn't sure why he hadn't said this. He just hadn't. For one thing, his father hadn't seemed to notice, but he wasn't sure if that was the main reason. For another, he felt it was a mistake to talk about such teeth out loud. When he had seen the teeth, Brother Monson's teeth, the thing he had thought was that Brother Monson was not completely alive. Both his teeth and the way he held himself stiff had made him think this. What a terrible thing, he couldn't help but think, walking beside his father as they reached the top of the street and then cut left and walked to their house. What terrible teeth. It was, of course, he convinced himself, all nonsense. He'd let the strangeness of an old man get the better of him. He had bad teeth, so what? He was old. That someone that old still had teeth at all was a sort of minor miracle. No, it was nothing to be concerned about. And yet, when his friend David came over, he couldn't help talking about the teeth, or at least trying to. He didn't know how to describe them. He didn't know what to say. That had been the first time, a little over a week ago. This was this time. School had let out for the day, and Jens was playing Chinese checkers with David, talking about nothing, when he heard the phone ring upstairs. Do you need to get that? David asked. Jens shook his head. My mom will. The phone rang another 4 times, though, before they heard through the ceiling the sound of his mother's heels tapping their way across the floor above. The ringing stopped. A moment later, his mother called down, Jens, it's for you. Jens sighed and stood. He climbed the stairs and took the receiver from his mom where she proffered it, cord stretched taut from the head of the stairs. Hello, he said. Jens? It was his father's voice. He wanted Jens to go over to Brother Monson's and mow his lawn. The church asked me to do it a few days ago, said his father, but I have too much on my plate. I need you to help out. David's over, said Jens. You're doing homework? No, just hanging out. Take him along then, said his father. He can help haul the push mower over there. Brother Monson is kind of weird, said Jens. He didn't feel he could say no outright, but he didn't want to see the old man again. He's just old, said his father. He held out a little longer, but in the end gave in. He went back downstairs and told David, the teeth guy you were telling me about? He nodded. You don't have to come, Jen said. You can go home if you want, or just hang out here until I'm done. David shrugged. I don't mind, he said. I'm curious. Let's go. And so they went, taking turns pushing the lawnmower along the sidewalk and across the street, bumping it over the curb. It was warm outside, the air muggy, and even though it wasn't far, by the time they arrived, they were sweaty and short of breath. They pulled the lawnmower onto the parking strip in front of Brother Monson's house, wrestled it into Brother Monson's yard. The grass there was high and ragged enough that it was going to seed. They abandoned the mower there and climbed the steps to the porch. Jens rang the doorbell. He and David waited. Maybe he didn't hear it, David finally said. He just takes a long time to come. But when, after a minute or two, Brother Monson still hadn't come, Jens rang the doorbell again. Again they waited. He's not here, said David. He's old. He never goes anywhere. Maybe this time he did. Jens shrugged. We can just mow his lawn, said David. We don't have to get permission in advance, do we? Sure, said Jens. But just as they were turning to go back down the steps, the door opened. It was Brother Monson. He was wearing the same shirt he had been wearing when Jens had last seen him, or at least one very much like it. But now it was dark and stiff all along one side, as if that side had soaked in the thick, dark liquid and then dried without being cleaned off. He smelled strange, as if something inside his body had curdled. His posture was just as stiff as before, perhaps stiffer. In addition to his back, he didn't seem to be able to rotate his neck at all. His eyes behind his lenses had gone milky and opaque. Brother Monson mumbled something incomprehensible. Brother Monson, said Jens, we're here to mow your lawn. The church sent us. The old man turned his body slightly, directing his head vaguely in the direction of Jens' voice. He gave no impression of having understood Jens's words. Beside him, Jens felt David take a step back. Brother Monson just stood there, mouth drooping open, hollow teeth on display. How could he even chew with those, Jens wondered. And then the old man shuffled slowly around until he was pointed back into the house and tottered back into the darkness, not bothering to close the door. I will stop there. Story goes on, but that gives you a sense of where it's coming from.
All right. Thanks. Am I back? Did I unmute myself?
You're back. Yeah, you're back.
I'm back. So where what collection is that? Was that from last year's?
So that's from, it's from None of You Shall Be Spared, which is out at Weird House. They have signed hardbacks and signed paperbacks for sale at their web house. If you just type Weird House and my name, you can easily find it. And that I have lots of stories about teeth. I don't know what it is, but I do have a weird obsession with teeth.
You have a teeth.
Ghost teeth.
You don't mean to, but someone pointed it out, or you realize you're like, hey, as long as you keep being inspired by these things, or you keep having something to say, I think I think go for it. Or
no, I agree. I'll probably always have teeth, and I may not personally always have teeth, but they'll always come up.
I'll always have teeth,
right?
Until I don't. Also, while we're mentioning where we can find books, so they can find that one directly from the publisher. Where can they find McSweeney's 71 directly from the publisher? I know I saw it on Amazon. I think you can ask for it at your favorite independent bookstore. There's the Book Bin in Salem, Oregon. I see Obadiah is here or was here. Is that the best place? Best places? Do you have a place you can recommend, a favorite indie bookstore or a place you can grab?
I think you can get it at Skylight, which is a bookstore in Los Angeles. That's a really great bookstore. But yeah, I would say at their website, at the Book Bin. If you are living up in the mountains and can't get to a bookstore, then I guess Amazon, if you can get them delivered to you up there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think McSweeney's. Their website's a great place to get it if you can't get it just at a.
Okay, great. Before I think we have time to talk about 2 or 3 more stories. Before we do that, I just want to mention a couple of our colleagues on my radar. I want to mention a fellow author and a podcast. It's called Horror from the High Desert. It's a podcast hosted by horror writer and filmmaker Scotty Milder, and he's the author of numerous short stories and director of the feature film Dead Billy. First and foremost, an enthusiast of the genre, Scotty engages in conversation with writers, filmmakers, and fans about the work horror today. And I think his most recent episode, he has author Derek Cavagnano, who just has a book came out, and I think he's having director Tom Eberhardt who I guess he directed Night of the Comet, is coming on February 9th. And also someone familiar to the show, Gwendolyn Keist. He'll be talking to Gwendolyn Keist about our upcoming novel, The Haunting of Elkwood. So you could find Scotty Milder and Horror from the High Desert Podcast wherever podcasts are streamed. Another colleague I want to mention is Gigi Silverman, and she has a new literary project. I believe it's a literary journal out. I think it's called The Green Sheaf, and the submissions are now open for the Green Sheaf Flash Fiction Prize and the Green Sheaf Poetry Prize, and that's open to female and gender fluid writers only. We love writing inspired by folklore, fairy tales, mythology, the mystical, and the weird. To learn more about the aesthetic and submit, please visit thegreensheaf.com. The last colleague I want to mention, we mentioned him before your reading, Nick Mamatas. He's been writing horror and strange fiction and weird fiction for quite some time. He has a story out now from Bain.com in Weird World War III China. It's called Empty Your Cup or Dry It, and you can find that at Bain.com. And of course, all those places we mentioned, looking for books, you can grab a copy of Nick's 2021 novel, The Second Shooter, and more. So let's get back to McSweeney's 71. A story that I'm really fond of all the stories. But I think this was my first time reading a story by Attila Veres, a story called Here and Now and Then and Forever. Yeah, this was one of my favorites of the bunch. There's a lot going on. I mean, I don't want to load it, but I will load it because I have a lot to say about it because I liked it a lot. But yeah, I might be looking at it completely. In fact, I think I looked at it a lot differently than you. I know we were discussing this a little bit, but yeah, dive into that story. Tell me what you see and what you like about that story.
Well, it's so first of all, I think Veres is just doing his stories in general are just amazing. He's doing really excellent work, and the stories are just really original. He's Hungarian writer, also a filmmaker. But yeah, his book, The Black Maybe, which came out with Valancourt maybe a year or two ago now, is one of my favorite books of stories in the last few years. But this story is like I kind of describe it as multi-level marketing horror. And there is a
you're not wrong.
No, I'm not wrong. But that's what's going on. But there's another level of horror beneath that, and then there's another level of horror outside that as well.
And it's definitely say this story is like, don't try this at home. Like, everything but the kitchen sink is thrown in here, but it just feels so organic and smooth and real. Everything's in there, yet everything's falling apart.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And he's really good at kind of juggling those different balls. I don't want to say too much about it because I don't want to give away the weirdness of the story. I mean, I think that part of the effectiveness of the story is when you suddenly realize what's going on. But you suddenly realize that the multi-level marketing is both a really awful thing.
I see what you don't want to spoil.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So we'll just keep it at that. Let's talk. I mean, so on the what initially, I guess everyone has their own red line of death, or when you're engaged in a story, or you just know it's not working. But the voice immediately, like the way he went straight into what I'm calling the internal stakes of this character. Like this character is like, you're like, who this character is, it's at stake. It's at stake for her in the story, the narrator. And you really feel for her because she's just like sort of giving herself an eternal mantra and eternal talk. And she's a salesperson. She's like, I want to be a success. I'm a success if I just, and you feel for her because you're like, oh shit, it looks like you're trapped in this a multi-level pyramid scheme. You're like, oh shit. And so you're just, perhaps if there's no genre element, just that human thing is just like, so it's a really effective literary story or just a really effective character portrayal because you're hooked, you're there, you're with it. But then, there are all these things like the the external stakes may be like there's a whole lot like of what that pyramid scheme may. You said, oh, when you realize it, I never got my footing on this because
Well,
I kept.
Yeah, you can decide how real or not real.
Yeah, and maybe more than that, because there are certain times where I was convinced things were real, but then they were like I felt like I kept slipping on the thin ice or the banana peel, like I was being intentionally that's, but not negatively. Like I felt like he maneuvered by using the point of view and what was going on. So like it's in it. I think it takes place in Hungary. And one of the things that's happening is like the world is falling apart around us, not much unlike our world today. But then because I doubted, there's certain things I didn't doubt because I felt like through the point of view, I saw some pretty horrific things, which raised even more stakes. And I just kept looking at it. I was like, don't try this at home. You know, like this was really, this was, and I just felt excited. I felt excited by that. You know, like you said, how do you break down? How do you break down the walls? And I'm like, I will try it at home. You know, I mean, I'm the sort of writer where, the story's going to mean something different to everyone. But it's like, you can have really ambitious stories. And one of the things I hate about quote unquote big stories where the world is at stake is I feel like the stakes, it's meaningless to me when the world is at stake because nothing is at stake. And Varys gave me both the thrill and excitement and sense of horror and wonder of big stakes by having the small stakes of what was at stake for this narrator, much in the same way that Enriquez did, but much in the same way structurally, yet totally of a different flavor and uniqueness.
Very, very different flavor.
And I was. That's when when I got to the story, I'm just like, I'm just really loving this book and the way the stories are working together. Cool. Hats off to this.
And there is something about like your reaction where you were like, I believe it, I don't believe it. That's like very much like if you are being solicited by a multi-level marketing scheme. It's like how you're like, no, it's not true unless. And the way they kind of drag you in. So,
and then like sometimes like in a good detective story or a noir story, or even like a weird wild story, you just have a really simple through line. Like I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to go to point A to point B to point C. I'm going to go from this thug to this thug to this thug till I get to the top. So it's a very simple and clear through line for just hung on that hat rack. Is just a lot of wildness, and I'm gonna get myself, pick up a copy of this book, read it, tell us what you think, love it or hate it, but you'll love it. And I gotta get is the Black maybe doing the same sort of things that this story does.
It's different in some ways, but all the stories are doing really
in its uniqueness. It's
none of those stories are multi-level marketing stories.
Of course.
But it was interesting when he was one who I solicited for the volume just because I'd read The Black Maybe and just had really loved it. And so I wrote to him, and he, his English is pretty good because he works in the film world over there, so he can communicate in English. But he sent me a list of like kind of with descriptions of different stories that he'd written that hadn't been translated yet.
Oh wow!
So we kind of went through and kind of made choices.
You got to pick.
Me and
did he say multi-level marketing? Did you immediately say I must have this fresh horror in my book of fresh horror?
It was funny because we had James Ye, who was the managing editor at the time, had two that we were like, I think we want one of these. And then we wrote to him and then he wrote back and said, I just finished another story. And he described this story, and I was like, that's the one. We want that one.
What a joy.
But he has like at least a book of stories that is ready to be translated.
Waiting for you.
Comes out sometime. Yeah.
Wow. Publishers, perk up there. We'll move. Let's move on from that one to not spoil it because it could be spoilable.
It's really easy to spoil that one.
So getting back to tropes, as I'm talking to you and I'm just sort of telling you my reaction to as I picked through the ones that were my favorites to talk to you about. I think I wrote somewhere that of the stories that I read in 2023, if you had told me that perhaps my top two of my top stories that I've read would be werewolf stories, I would slap you and be like, no, shut your mouth. That can't be true. But now I don't want to say the name of the other one, because part of the joy of the other story by one of my favorite writers, and it's not really a surprise, Kelly Link, to know who that writer is. You know, part of the joy is discovering what Kelly Link has done with the trope. I didn't quite, I'm like, when I come into a Kelly Link story, it's like entering an alien environment or another environment. So like, I even kind of like missed it. Like I was like reading the story on a whole other level until someone's like, oh, did you get, and I was like, what? Oh my, I just read it twice of just like, but that being said, on the other end of the spectrum, and is The Wolves by Senna Ahmad. And right, so like when I see that it's I approach straight up, I'm at the point in my interest, or I approach the straight up tropes with a little bit of skepticism. But she won me over with just that first line. First line is, there were wolves who turned into men under the light of the full moon. So right from the start, I sat up at attention, and I'd never read her before. And in addition to the other things that this story is doing, this might be not that there's a winner or a loser, but this was absolutely gorgeous prose. Like I was on a sentence level. I'm just like, oh, lush, immersive sentence after lush, immersive, poetic, insightful sentence on a sentence level. So I'm just like, going back to what you said in your introduction, and that of your discovering some of your other finalists can be, and they're like, wow, this is just, I can just read this story about just like, this is just a great immersive
it's
story.
I really love that story, and that was a story I picked out of the slush pile. It was like submitted, and I came across it, and it has this amazing thing going on in terms of immigration, has the weirdness of the werewolf trope being kind of flipped, and then as you say, it's like one of the real joys of that story is just how beautifully written it is. It's like lyrical. It feels like it's being told orally, but also being told in this really, almost like fable-like way. And all that really adds up to just make it a terrific story.
And it might have been too hard to stump, because what happens is awful, right? Just awful. So it played with the trope. Was it Thackeray? You said the other, so Thacker. So like, the monster. So it's not, stories can still be forward facing without having to be necessarily original, because the human monster is infinitely more worse than any universal monster we can come up with. That concept is while it may have been new at some point, it's not new anymore, but it still can be inverted and played with and delivered in a really effective way by, I think, the choices of what we put on the page, and the choices of what to see. And this was a story that, like, I may have been inclined to skip or inclined not to, but I'm really glad it became, I don't want to say a guilty pleasure, but it really became a pleasure, an unexpected pleasure. And thus you fulfill the obligations of you kind of like, you got under the skin of this cynical, potentially cynical horror reader.
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes people have this notion that, I have to do something really new. And I understand that. And there are stories I've read that,
don't get me wrong. This is still new, and this is still new and unique. It's still, what she's doing is not by any means common structurally in any way.
But you're right. I mean, I think that the kind of basic concept is something we recognize. And then it's, how do you elaborate on that concept? How do you make it into something new and unique? So, and she's very good at that.
It was unique just in the sentence level prose, in the structure. Again, like maybe I'm wearing it down by saying don't try this at home, but by telling, there's a lot of first person, breaking the first person wall.
Yeah.
There's a lot of structural leaps in time, a
Mhm.
lot of the narrator commenting on the story, which is that's high level stuff from a writer's point of view to, I think, to wield effectively. I mean, I think a
Yeah.
lot of people do wield it, and you just, when it clunks, it sure does clunk. And
Yeah.
this was just
Yeah.
lyrical
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
smooth.
No, I was very glad to find the story, and I felt like it did something that was a little different than anything else in the
So this was a
volume.
slush pile survivor. Wow,
It was a slush pile survivor. Yeah.
what a gem! What a gem of a
I,
story.
absolutely. Yeah. No,
Um,
and I, as with you, I hadn't actually read her work. I vaguely recognized her name, but since I've read other stories of hers, and they're all just really good.
does she have collections?
She doesn't. Last I checked, she didn't have a collection, but I
Wow.
think she's kind of on her way to a collection.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, publishers take note. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'll have to ask you for some more. Look up. I willingly read more of her.
Yeah.
In a heartbeat. So yeah, we're sort of talking about how stories are told can be just as important, perhaps, as context. And I think
Mhm.
last month, or at the end of the year, in the how stories are told mode, the name that springs to mind is Jeff Ford. So I mean,
Yeah.
Jeff
Yeah.
Ford's what's the name of his story again?
Yeah, I should know that since I.
It's all right. But
Um,
yeah, but you know what? Just tune in. Just tune in on the YouTube page. Jeff read the entire story
yeah,
in
a
that way
hundred, a
that
hundred nights of nothing
A
is the name of the
Hundred
story.
Nights of Nothing.
Yeah,
And Jeff Ford, read by Jeff Ford, starring
yeah,
Jeff Ford
before,
in the
yeah.
story. And that's
No, and
just,
he reads that story so well. I saw him read it at ReaderCon
yeah.
last year, and his voice reading that story is just perfect.
Yeah. He's, for if you're a fan of this channel, you've probably heard Jeff Ford or heard him read before. If you haven't, you're in for a treat, just in Jeff Ford's fiction. And he just does even before he was doing, he's been, he has that, crosses that meta line where he inserts himself as a character in quite a few of his stories. And
Yeah,
this is just
yeah,
the latest to do it.
yeah. I think he has. I was talking to Gavin Grant, his publisher at Small Beer, and
Mulberry
I
Press.
think he has basically a book of those Jeff Ford stories, where Jeff Ford's a character.
Oh my God.
So,
Yeah. I
and
mean,
they're
that
kind of,
just,
yeah, there's a lot of them are scattered in other books, but I'd love to see like a book that
yeah.
says Jeff Ford by Jeff
Yeah.
Ford.
I have a lot. I could say about that, but hopefully we'll just reference another episode about
Yeah, yeah,
Jeff Ford, Jeff Ford on Jeff Ford.
yeah, yeah.
But moving on to I think the last story that we're going to have time for is the last story in the book, and it's Lover's Lane by
Hmm.
Stephen Graham Jones. And again, it's a great, it's a strong choice just on its own, but it does incorporate a lot of the things we've talked about tonight, because a lot of the things that you put forth in your introduction and a lot of things you put forth in your story choices, it talks about Lover's Lane is a story that has something to say about folklore.
Yeah.
It has something to say about coming to a story, about context, and it's something to say about structure and more. Tell me about all these wild elements, or not even just tell me about all these different elements and why it's a great forward-facing and to
Yeah.
wrap it up for you, and why you put it there and that
Well, so
batting
so
cleanup position.
yeah, I felt like it was a good story to end with, just because, I mean, first of all, Stephen is just such a capable writer, and I mean, the thing that's like funny with Stephen is it's like I feel like at this point he's written a story in every subgenre of horror. And so when I asked him to send a story, I didn't know for sure what I was going to get. And this story is very much a story about, it's from the perspective of a woman. She's talking about an experience that she gets obsessed with as an amateur folklorist, and that seems to have an effect on her life. but it's also, you know, something that she seems to be reporting online as well.
So what a great choice, and it talks to just the genius of Stephen Graham Jones right there, because we made fun of Fritz Leiber. How dare I made fun of Fritz Leiber for not being wieldy, or at least, or maybe at the time it was perfectly fine. In The Smoke Ghost, he wanted to talk about the genre and the structure, and it came across, at least to our 100 years later, as unwieldy. But by choosing his choice of character, he gets a free shot where doesn't feel unwieldy at all to talk about folklore. So this is a folklorist who is investigating a folklore in a story where there's folklore. So there's these levels going on, and without giving any spoilers, like, so he just immediately, I think one of the things that he lets the reader know that you're going to get hit hard is, I think he just talks about the border crossing, and I'm not sure if it's El Paso or Nogales or another border town. He's like, yeah, we all know about folklore, and like, oh, there's the folklore about how someone just hollowed out a baby and like went through and stuffed it full of drugs. So you're just like, oh, like there's all these horrible things. And he plays with a different, this is not a strange tale, but it's a story that wields intentional ambiguity in a much different way. Perhaps it's more akin to a high concept mystery, like really deftly done, really it has the smoothness and organicness of a Kelly Link story, but you could tell that to pull this off, he really thought good and hard about how the story fits together.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the horror element's a quiet horror element, but it's there kind of beneath the surface. But yeah, it has this weird, because it's a folklorist talking about folklore, and then also goes back to what's happened to.
So you get the nature. You get the you can get to talk about the nature of folklore and the nature of horror, and that was also just fascinating, and why I thought it was fascinating on its own right to be in the end spot, because it talks about the internet. And again, another thing where I'm like, oh God, I don't, where I'm just like, I don't want to talk, but it was so interesting because the observations are so astute and so timely about what that means. And it was something I had disdain for. It was something I didn't want to talk about. And I'm just like, hands down, you got me. I'm like, you got me again. Like I wanted to knock you out. I wanted to, and I couldn't. Like the strength of the story won me over. And that's not,
it's a good story.
Loved it that way.
Yeah, and it's either the longest story in the volume or pretty close. It's the Kantoska story might be about as long, but he makes really good use of that space. I mean, the story needs that kind of length to kind of develop in the way it does. So
I love that, where you're like, I didn't know what I was going to get.
Yeah, but so that I didn't know what I was going to get, but I knew since it was Stephen, it was going to be
right. Good. You're like, what flavor of greatness is it going to be?
Right, exactly.
And obviously you made a decision to put it in that spot. So it really, you could read the book any way you want, but like if you're like me looking at it with a critical eye on analyzing it, I wanted to know, I'm like, well, what was Brian saying to me by putting this story here? What was he saying to me by putting the refrigerator cemetery first? How do you feel the book came out? Before we go, how's it? What's it been like for you to have this fun project?
It was really fun for me, and I'm really happy with the range of stories. It has people like Stephen who have published a lot of books. It also there's a writer in the volume, Sidney Emerson, who did the story "The Haunting of the Wilsons" by Me and That Bitch Todd, which is kind of a humorous ghost story. That's her first kind of national publication.
Oh,
and that was great. Another one that came just out of nowhere. So I feel like, it's nice to have that range. I feel like the stories are talking to each other in interesting ways.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to me when I talk to people because depending on whether they come from the horror side of the equation or the literary side of the equation, they'll be like, oh, I really like this story or that story. The common story is probably
Have there been surprises in or overlaps, surprises, overlaps, notes.
There's definitely some overlap. So I would say like the traditional McSweeney's reader, the story that keeps coming up is that Sidney Emerson story, and it's partly it has a kind of McSweeney's humor feel to it.
Okay.
And then, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to me which stories people key on. Some people, the Vera story is too much for them, for instance, if they're like more literary. But I love that story.
But that's cool to like know that there's like, because everyone has their limits, and I have I certainly have mine. For sure. And it's fascinating to think about it this way. And McSweeney's is just great. And I don't know who McSweeney's readers are, but I have a feeling that they're probably a pretty open-minded bunch, and they're up for the fun or they're up for the trying. I don't know who the people are, but maybe it's been a decade or maybe two or more where I felt like Stephen King, for whatever reason, he just desperately, I don't know if Stephen King desperately wants to do anything, but I feel like he had a collection came out that like, I think he really wanted to be recognized as literary. And I think he wrote a collection and was writing stories. And I think he was just not getting that motion or not getting that traction from the people who he wanted to. And looking at it from like my vantage, I'm just like, like you had everything you wanted without even trying to change your stories. I felt like King's stories could be put in a literary context or even taught to have like some literary things or things that you so I was just like, I don't know, like these I was thinking these distinctions could be meaningless a long time ago, probably around the same time you were thinking it, but I was just thinking it as a reader.
Well, I think actually, if I'm remembering correctly, I think maybe 4 or 5 issues ago, McSweeney's did a Stephen King story in it, which is really interesting to think about crossover. So I think that there have been these, as I was mentioning, Carmen Maria Machado and Kelly Link, there have been these writers that were kind of opening the door. And I think that was what probably made them finally decide, let's do a horror issue and see where it goes. So, and it was a privilege to do. It was really fun. Yeah. I loved reading the stories. There were a few stories that I would have loved to include that I didn't have space for, that I just couldn't get kind of traction for. But I'm really happy with how it turned out. Yeah,
and it's just thanks for sharing the insights. It's just context is we're talking about King. I'm talking about another one of my now it just slipped my mind, but of just how like you can have a story published published in the Wall Street Journal, and then have the same story about a story about the same author published in like Lady Churchill's, and suddenly one is mainstream and one is slipstream, but it's the same thing. It's the same story. It's all about the context. The distinctions are everything. The distinctions are nothing. Thanks for talking about what's monstrous, what's horrible, what has been, what was.
Thanks for having me on.
What might be. This was great. Thanks to our friends and colleagues for coming. Be sure to so check where can everyone get McSweeney's 71 from the publisher?
The publisher, you can get it at independent bookstores near you, and if you need to, you could go to Amazon as well.
All right, and you have a collection out now. What is that one, and what's the one that's coming at coming in 2024, which is now?
So the collection that is just out is None of You Shall Be Spared, which is from Weird House. The collection that is coming out is called Good Night, Sleep Tight, and it's coming in September from Coffee House Press.
Thank you so much to Brian Evenson. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time. Take care now.